So Natasha Denona recently came out with a Mini Gloom palette, and it has been living in my head rent-free, so I'm going to try to dupe it out with my existing collection. And I want to say right off the bat that this is not going to be an exact dupe, partially because usually when I dupe out palettes, I will change things like a little bit here and there to fit my preferences because I am designing this palette for myself, but also because specifically with Natasha Denona, her palettes use a lot of like standard shimmers, and some of her formulas have improved in recent years. They're a bit more sparkly, a bit more special, but from what I can tell with this palette, they're all just like regular standard shimmers, and that's just not something I use a ton of in my collection, and also I just don't have a lot of in my collection. So I'm going to be using mostly like indie special shimmers, which are going to be more high shine and probably a little bit shifty. First, I'm going to dupe out just the existing 5-pan palette, but then I also want to try to extend the palette into more of her midi palette size with 15 pans and kind of like imagine what would happen if I extended it out and made it like a more versatile color story that you could get more looks out of. So I'm going to begin with duping out the mattes in the palette, starting with the middle shade, which is described as a matte medium muted olive. And at first I thought that the mattes in the Yucca palette would be a pretty good match for it, specifically these two, but I don't know if you can tell on camera, these have quite a bit of a warm undertone with a lot of yellow in them, and I felt like the Gloom palette overall leaned very cool toned. It was almost like the olive shade in there was more of like a cool toned muted olive. So I pulled out this matte from Unearthly Sorcerer Smoke palette. It's the shade Eucalyptus, and you can see when I swatch it out, it is far more cool toned than the other two, and it has that like gloomy vibe to it. So this was the first shade that I went with for my dupe. The second matte from the palette is the shade Cinder, which is described as a matte, dark, dusty olive taupe. And I actually felt like this shade Flax, which is originally from the Yucca palette, felt like a pretty good match for it because I feel like this does have that like slightly dusty olive undertone to it, and it is like, it's not like the deepest darkest shade, but I felt like it had enough depth to kind of do the job, you know what I mean? Now moving on to the shimmers, I'm starting with the shade Zephyr, which is supposed to be a metallic light taupe champagne. And please keep in mind that my shimmers are going to be a little different in formula and texture than the original palette. I'm just going for vibes. So these are the 3 shades that I chose. This is Glaminatrix's Panda, this is from Glaminatrix's Bonfire palette, the shade Cinder, and then this is from Wicked Widow's American Psycho palette, and you can see them all over here. I actually feel like this shade from Wicked Widow tonally makes the most sense because it has a slightly like olive yellow undertone to it, but texturally the one from Glaminatrix, the shade Panda, makes the most sense because it's like a metallic shade more so than like a high shine sparkly shade. But honestly, for my dupe, I'm going to go with the middle one from the Bonfire palette, the shade Cinder, because it has that like slightly taupey undertone, and the sparkles are more of like an icy silver palette or silver color, but I feel like that actually goes with my vision for the expanded Gloom palette, especially when I'm thinking about the theme gloom. I associate it with like a rainy day and droplets of water, and for some reason this shade just really reminds me of that. The next shimmer is the shade Verdant. It's described as a sparkling metallic dusty petroleum green, and this is the one that I struggle to dupe the most because I really don't have anything like this in my collection color-wise or texture-wise, and I do think this is supposed to be the most sparkly shade in her palette because it's described as a sparkling metallic rather than like a regular metallic, but even then I just feel like, I don't know, nothing in my collection quite matched up. These are the 2 shades that I chose. This one is Aquila from Divina, and this one is Breeze from Shine by SD. And you'll notice with the original shade in the Gloom palette, it is described as a dusty petroleum green, but it has quite a bit of blue in it, which I felt like both of these shades have that. And I do feel like the Shine by SD shade is probably a closer match because it's deeper and it leans a bit more blue. But I'm actually going to go with Aquila because I just feel like for my preferences, I would prefer something that doesn't have as deep of a base. And also Aquila is more sparkly. It's a bit more textured than Breeze, which again is just, it aligns more with my preferences. I feel like now it's starting to look more like its final form, but we have one more shade to go. It's the shade Glint, and it's described as a metallic light medium dusty rose. These are the two shades that I shortlisted. So this is Terramoon's Deimos and this is Glaminatrix Robin. Both of them are single shadows, and you can see swatched out, they both have that pinky quality to them, but Robin is quite a bit lighter, and I feel like on me it does not read as pink. And honestly, I just wanted something that was a bit more of that like dusty rose color. So I'm gonna go with Terramoon's Deimos because I just feel like it fits the bill a little bit better and goes with the palette overall, because this shade is already quite light and this shade is a bit on the darker side. So I wanted something in between that was a bit more mid-toned. So here's my dupe fully assembled as well as swatched out. And of course it looks pretty different from the original version just because my shimmers are quite high shine and shifty and things like that. But the thing is, like, even though I look at the Gloom palette and it makes me happy, like visually, realistically, I probably would not use the shimmers all that much because they just don't align to my preferences. Like, I would probably use them in like a layering capacity, but two of them are quite light. And I prefer my base shimmers for layering to be a bit more mid-toned or deeper. So I don't even know how much use I would have gotten out of those shimmers. So I'm really glad that I just duped it out because this color story makes me happy, but I am so much happier with these shimmers. But also this is just a 5-pan, so it's not like you're going to be able to get like a ton of different looks out of it, which is also why I wanted to expand this into a 15-pan color story to just have like a more versatile palette. When I was thinking of expanding this palette, I kept a couple of things in mind. First of all, I wanted the final 15-pan palette to have that gloom theme. I wanted to feel like dingy and murky and desaturated overall with maybe just a couple of pops, because this one, as you can see, is like, I think this ends up being the brightest shade in the overall palette, if I'm not mistaken. But still, I wanted it to be mostly gloomy in the mattes especially, even if the shimmers bring a little bit of punchiness. I feel like that's typically how I like to do my makeup anyways, like keep the mattes a bit more on the muted side, and then all of that brightness and punchiness comes from the shimmers. Then the other thing that I kept in mind was I wanted to retain like this color story. Like I didn't want to really add in new colors. And what I mean by that is everything I added on for the most part kind of like stays in this color family, but just slightly altered. So I either changed the tone or the depth or the saturation or things like that, but it kind of still ties back to this initial color story. So the first kind of shade I knew I wanted to add onto the palette was something to match this shimmer over here, because I felt like we just needed something a bit more cool toned and like a bluish type of green with a lot of gray in it, since the only green leaning matte we have in the palette is this one over here. And as I said previously, this is more of an olive undertone. And yes, it is more of a cool olive when you compare it to warm olives, but then in this color story, it actually appears quite warm. So I just wanted to add something that was more of that like bluish, greenish, gray type of shade, very murky and gloomy. So of the three shades over here, I just feel like the one in the middle, and my fingers are flipped, these two are flipped, but I felt like the one in the middle made the most sense because this one is a little too light. I feel like in terms of depth level, it's just a little too like similar to this one over here, which let me swatch that out as well. Like you can see that it's like, it's not distinct enough from this shade. I felt like this one was more, there was more of a difference, and I felt like this one leaned a little too blue, and I didn't want the palette to be like a bluish palette. I wanted to stay in like green territory, so I just felt like this one made the most sense. I'm gonna slot it in right here, and this is Bella Beauté Bar's Nourish from the Green Goddess palette. Next, I wanted to add in a mid-toned gray matte to kind of go with this taupey base over here and again reinforce that gloomy aspect of the palette. I felt like that's something I really wanted to keep intact. Here are three grays that I shortlisted once again, and you can see them swatched out over here. Once again, these two are flipped, and I ended up going with the one in the middle because I felt like this has, I won't say like a neutral gray tone, but this one is quite like, it has a bit of that like bluish greenish undertone, and I felt like it was just like too close to this shade over here. Like when I swatch it out, you can see that like undertone wise, this one is further away, and I just wanted to make sure that there was like enough of a difference between the mattes in the palette. Also, I felt like this one was just a little too light. It didn't have that like full dingy gloomy aspect that I wanted. I'm slotting it in right here next to the other shade just so you can see how much of a difference there is between the two, and this is Deep Sleep from Unearthly's Gargoyle palette. So after adding in these two mattes, my mind kind of jumped to adding in some depth for the palette, because right now with these three mattes at least, it's very mid-toned, and I like a lot of depth in my palettes, and also I think in a gloom themed palette, depth is very necessary to add that kind of like heaviness. I knew I wanted to add in some dark green to pair with both the olive green matte as well as this like bluish green grayish matte, and I only pulled two because, like, I'll be honest, there isn't like a ton of difference between dark greens, and I don't know how much you'll be able to see it in the palette here, which is why I properly swatched out, and even then I don't know how apparent it's gonna be in swatches. Truthfully, you could pair either of these with either of the green mattes and it would probably be just fine, but I ended up going with this one up top because it has a bit more blue in it while still being a dark green, and I just felt like that went with the overall cool toned vibe of the palette a bit better than this green down here, which is more of like a foresty green with like a, I don't know if I would say it's a yellow undertone, but it's just more of a true green. I'm slotting this in over here, and this is Glaminatrix Cosmetics Evergreen from their Bonfire palette. Now, continuing on with adding depth into this palette over here, I knew I wanted to choose a matte to pair with this brown matte as well as the gray matte over here, and I knew I wanted a cool toned brown matte to go into the palette with like a little bit of gray, just so that it would also work for the gray matte. And I pulled these shades over here, which I swatched over here, but I also swatched these two guys over here. And I think you can see that in the palette, this brown matte looks like it could be more of like a medium deep shade, but the thing about Natasha Denona mattes that I actually really love about her formula is that they can be applied quite sheerly and evenly, so I would actually consider this like a mid-toned matte. And so I feel like all three of these mattes have the right depth to work with these two, but I feel like this one leans a little too purple cool tone, so I don't feel like it works with the palette overall or with like this matte in particular. And I felt like this one in the middle was just like too deep dark. Like, it is such a deep dark brown that it's almost a black, and I wanted something that had just like a little bit more gray in it, and so I ended up going with this shade over here that I really do think works with both of these. I'm slotting it in over here, and this is Unearthly's Branch from the Fall Magic palette. Now I'm done adding in the neutral and green leaning shades, and I want to focus on adding in stuff to match this pink shimmer over here, and I knew that I wanted to add in like a dusty pink slightly cool tone matte, and I feel like in real life this doesn't necessarily look super cool toned. It is dusty, but it's not like, on its own, it doesn't look like the most cool tone, which is why I wanted to show you it next to these other mattes over here. This one is objectively more cool tone, but it's also a lot more pastel, and this one over here looks like super bright coral, and I did go ahead and swatch them just so you can see like just how like desaturated and dusty this is in comparison to this other shade. So I just felt like this made the most sense in this palette overall. Now that I've slotted it in, I think you can see what I mean by like the shade really pops amongst all these other shades right now. It looks quite bright, which is why I especially wanted to show you it next to these shades just to illustrate just how dusty it is compared to like other pinks that I have in my collection. And this is the shade Adore from Fantasy Cosmetica's Cradled in Ice palette. So since I won't shut up about adding depth into my palettes, you probably already guessed that I wanted to add something to pair with this pink matte over here, and it had to be a burgundy. I love adding burgundy into palettes. I think it's such an underrated tone, and I pulled these three options over here, which I once again swatched out over here. I am someone who cares a lot about nuance in undertones in palettes, and so I chose this one to go in the palette because I felt like this one had too much red in it, so it wasn't like cool toned enough for this palette, and this one down here had too much purple in it, but I didn't want to go into purple territory. I wanted to keep things like more pinky, so that's why I went with this one in the middle. I also feel like now that I've added in the burgundy into the palette, this pink looks a little bit less out of place. Like, it looks like it has a little family with those two shades. Now we get to move on to the shimmers, and there was one shade that I knew immediately right off the bat that I wanted to pull into this palette. I didn't even get any alternate options. This is the shade Chandelier from Cleona, and I have it swatched up top over here, and underneath is this shimmer over here, Aquila from Divina. And The reason that I wanted chandelier was I wanted basically like a lighter counterpart to the shimmer over here, something that also flashed like greenish blue, but then shifted to more of a pink at an angle, which by the way, I think that's what makes these shimmers tie really well into this palette with like the more pink burgundy tones. But yeah, that's why I wanted Cleona Chandelier. And in addition to like the greenish bluish sparkles straight to the camera, I feel like the reason it works really well with the other shades is it sits on this like light tan base, which I think makes it tie in with the more neutral aspects of the palette. And there are these like additional minuscule goldish sparkles that aren't really visible, but kind of just like give it this interesting quality to where you're like, is it cool fully? But it's got these like this slightly warm aspect to it that's not immediately obvious, which I feel like just kind of fits the vibe of the olive green matte in the middle as well. And that is why I slotted it in right over here. Then, in addition to chandelier, I wanted to add something that went further into like that dirty olive territory with kind of like that yellowy undertone in the sparkles. And I pulled these two shimmers over here and I swatched them out over here. The top one is Terra Moon's Enceladus and the bottom one is Terra Moon's Cesium, which swatched out, I feel like Cesium on camera is looking more of just like a neutral metallic, but in person I can very much see that like yellow, slightly olivey undertone. But in the end, I ended up going with Enceladus because though the base of this is more of that like cool toned bluish greenish base, I feel like the sparkles straight on are more of that gold. And so I felt like it was kind of like the halfway between this dirty olive shade and the more bluish greenish gray shade. And it just like made more sense within the palette overall. But then at the same time, you can see swatched out, it's different enough from Chandelier and Aquila. So I put that shade in over here. So I've been adding a lot of green shimmers into this palette, and now I want to round out some of the other tones. Specifically, I want to add more gray into the palette, but I'm not going to be adding another pink shimmer because I feel like there's already too much pink in here, and I just want this next shimmer that I add to be gray with just like a hint of pink to tie in with stuff, but not make the palette like a pink palette. So these are the three shimmers that I shortlisted and they're swatched out over here, and I think you can see all three of them have varying levels of pink and gray / neutral tones, but I feel like this bottom one over here is like way too pink. It's very vivid. The one in the middle leans like, it almost looks like a bit too neutral and like berry-ish almost. So I feel like this one up top over here is the best fit because it is very much gray with just like a slight hint of a pink shimmer, which is like at first not even obvious compared to these two that have way more pink, but I promise like on its own, like if you cover these up, you can see a bit more of that pink peeking out. And this is the shade Midnight Blossom from Unearthly's Shadowed Petal palette. The very last shimmer I wanted to add was something that was more of a neutral to cool chocolate brown shimmer to pair with the more neutral tones in the palette, and I'm a big fan of satin chocolate brown shimmers to use in a layering capacity as kind of like your base shade and then put a more topper shade over. And we have like several piecier like topper like shadows in this palette. So these are the two that I shortlisted and I have swatched them out over here. This one up top is actually, it's from the Bella Beauty Bar Unoriginal Nudes palette, and it's more of a satin in its base, and then it has these like icy silver sparkles dispersed throughout, which make it a really cool shadow like on its own, but it also lends itself really well to like toppers layering over it. Then this shimmer down here is one of the old Cleona Circle pans. It's the shade Caribou and it's swatched out over here. I thought it was actually going to be more cool toned. I really love this shimmer all over the lid, but not only is it less cool toned than this shade over here, but it's also just like more sparkly all throughout the base. So I feel like it makes less sense underneath topper shades. Here's the shade Echo from Bella Beauty Bar's Unoriginal Nudes palette now that it has been slotted in, and I do feel like it makes more sense with this color story than this one over here. So here's the final palette. I really love how it turned out because I feel like it retains the initial color story of the original 5-pan quint, but it just feels like an expanded version of it, and at the same time it does have that like gloomy feel to it. I don't know how to explain it, but I think especially if you cover up this shimmer over here, Aquila, like that's the brightest pop in the palette. I feel like, and without that there, it really does look quite gloomy. I think I said earlier that I wasn't really setting out to make a neutral color story, but I do feel like this is basically my version of that because there are like a couple of neutrals in here, but these are the kind of tones that I love to wear day to day for like a more approachable colorful look. Dusty pinks, muted olives, murky like teal shades, grays, like I don't know. I love this final palette so much. Here's the entire extended palette swatched out. I feel like you need to swatch it all out to get the full impact of a color story, but I also had to include some fun sparkle footage so you can see all of that gorgeous texture, and also my photo swatches for a better look at those multicolored sparkles that I love so much, as well as any shifts. Lastly, I wanted to include a labeled palette photo so that you don't have to scrub through the video looking for shade names. That's it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this palette and also just like the video overall. I'm still very new to doing BYOP content on YouTube, but you guys really loved my last one, so it has encouraged me to try to do that more often, at least like whenever I feel inspired, and I did feel very inspired to expand on the Natasha Denona Gloom palette. Like, this color story is very much a me color story, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!